Hello and welcome everybody. This is Grandmaster Sam Shankland. Today we're going to cover Game of the Day for Game 3 of the World Chess Championship match between Carlsen, the challenger, and Anand, the defending champion. So today we have a repeat of Game 1 with Carlsen having the white pieces, and in both Games 1 and 2, Carlsen and Anand played pretty timidly with white, I think. I think they mainly wanted to just see what the other guy was doing with black and not go straight into the immediate complications without reviewing that specific element of their preparation right before the game. So, like we saw, so Carlsen and Anand first two games were drawn without too much of a fight. Same thing for Anand Gelfand. So, nothing that's not expected, and it doesn't at all mean that we're going to see a boring match. And today was Game 3, which was the first game where we actually saw some kind of a fight. So, Carlsen playing white. Start with knight f3, d5, g3, which is a repeat of game 1. And now after g6, Carlsen started with c4, when in game 1 he played bishop g2, and he quickly played d4, and the position, it got very dry very quickly, and the game was actually drawn around move 15 or something, or somewhere very, very early. So Carlsen had planned c4. I mean, I don't know if we can call it an improvement or not, but it's clearly something different. He's looking to get a different kind of game. So Anand now has three main options. He can opt for a very solid setup, or actually four, I would say. He can opt with a very solid setup with c6, just trying to play some kind of Grunfeld-Slav hybrid and keep his strong point in the center, which is, I think, a very decent strategy for match play, because you want to just stay as solid as possible when you don't need to win with black. All you have to do is just win one game here or there, and then it's over. And so you're going to be more well equipped to do that when you have the white pieces. So c6 would be a thought. Knight f6 would transpose to some kind of standard Fianchetto-Grunfeld. Maybe white would have some extraneous options here, but normally black would have bishop g2 and bishop g7 already would have been thrown in. So it's possible that white could just try to switch to a normal kind of Grunfeld where black is unable to capture a knight on c3 because white hasn't developed it yet, but probably black should be fine here. So I would expect that we get some kind of Fianchetto-Grunfeld after bishop g2, bishop g7. Black can play d4 looking for a kind of Benoni, and then there's the move Anand played, which is capturing on c4. So, queen a4 check from Carlsen. So, this is a very safe move. He's hoping to simply recapture the pawn on c4, no questions asked, and this does get the job done. But it does waste a little bit of time with the queen, and they always tell people at the beginning of their chess careers, you should never bring your queen out too early in the game because it'll get chased around by your opponent's pieces while they're developing. So, well, Carlsen did manage to acquire more center pawns than black, and he's not down a pawn or anything like that. He did lose a little bit of time by bringing his queen out. So, other options he had, he could have considered just developing with a bishop with bishop g2 and trying to somehow take this pawn back later. It's not that easy for black to defend the pawn. So, there were other options, but Carlsen felt with queen a4 check. So knight c6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3. Notice that there's no moment where black can really defend this pawn. Bishop e6, for example, will always run into knight g5 with serious problems for black. So Carlsen can take this pawn back whenever he desires, which he felt this was the appropriate moment. But still, even though Carlsen took the pawn back, this queen is kind of misplaced on c4. It's not really doing that much, and it can very easily be targeted with a move like bishop e6. The queen would be much happier somewhere like on c2. So if white could somehow, let's just suppose black does stupid stuff. He plays bishop d7, bishop c8, bishop d7, and then white doesn't even do anything too fantastic and just sort of develops normally like this. This, I think, could be very promising for white. He's got very active pieces. His knight can come to e4 and c5, and black doesn't really have any counterplay. Of course, this is extremely complacent play on black's end, but it just goes to show that the queen on c2 is a lot better placed because it's less exposed. So instead of this ridiculousness, Anand played a much more natural and correct continuation with simply castling. d3 from Carlsen, getting ready to develop. And now Anand played h6. Probably he was preparing for bishop e6, but did not want to deal with any knight g5 later. And it's just a good prophylactic move in general. There's not really much that white can do at this point, and black has a solid position. He won't have any real trouble developing his pieces. Bishop d2 from Carlsen. At this point, both players have started to think, if the clock times are right here on ICC, we have 101 minutes for Anand and 98 minutes for Carlsen, which suggests each of them have spent a good 20 minutes It's possible that they were still remembering their preparation, and of course I'm sure both of them are very well aware of these kinds of positions and have studied them in some detail and understand the middle game plans, but I don't know if they were actually in their concrete preparation at this point, so they still have to find the moves on their own, even if they know the ideas. Okay, so knight d4 from Anand, which, if you see, was a serious thing, from down 8 minutes on his clock. It's probably a very nice move. Anand basically is arguing that he wants to weaken this e2 pawn, and by doing that he's attacking with the knight. If white ever plays e3, then he'll have serious weaknesses. In fact, e3 probably just loses directly to bishop e6, where the white queen is in some trouble, and then the d3 pawn will fall in short order, and it should just be completely winning for black, or darn close. But in the case of the more natural move, knight takes d4, which is played, e takes d4, we're seeing that this pawn on e2 is now backward. And Carlsen's comment after the game struck me as interesting. He said that if he got this kind of structure playing black, he wouldn't really mind it, because it's just like a Maroczy structure, and if you play the Maroczy pawn, you've got to be willing to play a structure like this one. But with white, it's not so ambitious. And very quickly, Anand started to take over the initiative. So knight e4, c6, just controlling some key squares. So here Carlsen played bishop b4, which it strikes me as unusual. I can't really point out what I don't like about it. It seems that the bishop was more active on d2. I don't really think the bishop has a future on b4 other than exchanging for the knight on e7. And while the position is somewhat closed, so exchanging a bishop for a knight shouldn't be a huge problem, more importantly, it'll bring the black queen to e7, which will very quickly target this e2 pawn, which, so the backward pawn could become weak. Bishop e6 from Anand, queen c1, and now a strong move, bishop d5. So, with this move, black is avoiding any trickery with knight c5, hitting the b7 pawn, and potentially he's able to exchange off the white squared bishops. And because his own white squared bishop can't really target e2, there's no way to, the pawn on d3 is a good defender, and the bishop on g4 will be unstable. The bishop on g2, however, could come to f3 and defend the e2 pawn, so exchanging white squared bishops would probably be in black's favor, so white is best advised not to move this knight on e4, but it's a little bit tricky to find a move here. So Carlsen came up with a4. I suppose he was just looking to gain some space on the queen side. And now Anand played b6. Definitely not a bad move, but this was one of the critical moments in the game, in my opinion, because it allowed white to later play a5. Another move Anand could consider would be a5 himself, which prevents white from opening up the a file. This is a very double-edged sword, because if black just closes the queen side entirely, it's going to be very hard to make progress, but after something like, say, bishop a3, which is consistent with the rest of white's play, putting the bishop on this diagonal, and now b6, if black is allowed to play c5, his pawn structure is not fluid at all, but he's really pacified this bishop on a3, which means that he can probably just play to open the king side, and it's going to be very difficult for white. So let's say white just plays, I don't know, h4. After c5, bishop is totally passive, and it's very hard to do anything about that. So let's say if he one day lets queen c2 to prepare b3 so that the bishop can come back around, black will play something like f5, knight d2, can exchange these guys, and now knight d5. And as soon as white plays b3, he's created this huge glaring hole on c3 that the knight can jump into. Here, after something like perhaps queen d7, preparing rook a to e8, someday f4, I think this looks extremely promising for black. With this in mind, I would say Carlsen would be best advised to avoid this kind of scenario, and he should probably grab e7. Sorry, not queen d7, that's an inferior move. And yeah, in this position I would slightly prefer black, but probably there's no real plan to make immediate progress. I don't know, it doesn't quite look that appetizing. Perhaps it makes more sense for white to play bishop a3 and only after b6, which weakens this pawn on c6 to exchange here, and now something like queen c2. And white will quickly play some, maybe rook a c1, rook fe1 to keep everything protected, knight d2, try to exchange the bishop on d5, and hopefully he'll have enough counterplay against these weak pawns by the open c-file and potentially knight on c4. So certainly not a crisis for white, but already the tide is starting to shift. So after b6, if black's allowed to play c5, I think it's very clear he'll be better. So Carlsen correctly exchanges off his bishop. Okay, we could have gotten this position. We were just discussing this exact position, except black's pawn was on a5 instead of a7. Okay, drawback of it being on a5 would be that the b6 pawn could be weakened in the event of knight d2 to c4, or that, as we saw later in the game, the a6 b5 plan, or just playing b5, is not as feasible, but at the same time it also eliminates white's possibility to play a5. In case, I think Anand has every reason to be satisfied here. So a5 from Carlsen, okay, b8. Got rook e1, just hoping to defend the e2 pawn so that this knight is no longer frozen. Got c8. At this point it's quite hard to find an active plan for either side, but still optically I prefer black because he can think about throwing his pawns on the queen side someday. So we exchange, and now we see the point of black playing a5 before instead of b6 is that here the open a file really is in white's control, which is probably a little bit annoying for black, but not a huge deal. So queen f4 from Carlsen, looking for active play. And now Anand came up with a move here that I really, really like. So, actually, no, he didn't. Rook d8. The next move was the one I really liked. Yeah, so king h7 I thought was a very powerful move. The point of king h7 is that Anand wants to play bishop e5 and expel the white queen from her active post, but he doesn't want to allow queen takes h6. So it's funny that I would consider the move king h7 to be extremely ambitious, because it's just sort of a king move. It looks like it's not really doing that much, about like advancing the queenside pawns or anything like that. But I think it definitely is helping. It's helping a lot to expel the white pieces. And then pretty quickly we're going to see this white queen is relegated all the way back to h1, which is definitely not a good sign. Knight d2 from Carlsen, natural enough, eyeing the c4 square, and it makes sense to try to exchange the bishops because, well, black has the bishop pair, so knight against bishop is usually a better bet than knight and bishop against two bishops. Bishop e5, h5, very well played by Anand, and now another excellent decision, bishop e6, which relegates the queen all the way back to h1. It's a very passive queen. So, okay, black must play c5 because the pawn is hanging. But here, this queen on c1 is so passive, and black is able to quickly play b5 and c4 on the queen side, probably because of the absence of the white queen defending, and it's hard to see any counterplay for white. So I think Anand must have been very satisfied here. Knight e4, king g7, just stepping out of the way of any knight g5 business. Carlsen plays knight g5 anyway. And okay, I listened to Anand's comments after the game, and he said that he believed that if the white squared bishops were exchanged, that he'd have no advantage or nothing to play for. So for this reason, he rejected moves like bishop f5 or bishop g4, presumably on account of the move bishop h3, which will exchange these bishops and leave white with no problems. So Anand decided to just roll forward with b5, a decision I wholeheartedly approve of. He simply wants to play c4 and then maybe even c3 and just have a very powerful passed pawn there. While, okay, the white can take his bishop back, but it's not really that effective. So here Carlsen made a very, very big decision. He completely changed the character of the position to move e3. And if you look, 28 minutes down to 16, so 12 out of 28, he used almost half of his time on this move. Which is probably a correct decision in terms of time management, because it's very important if you're going to drastically change the character of the position to make sure you do your due diligence. So takes and okay, so here was Anand's big decision. Of course he considered bishop takes b2, which the computer loves, but it's a very hard move for a human to play. After rook a to e1, black will almost certainly have to give back his extra pawn on e6, and then the real question is what matters more, this passer who runs straight down the board, or the seriously compromised black king. So the computer was definitely loving this for black, and it was giving, I think, almost even a winning advantage. Let's say something like rook b6, bishop h3. It just looks really scary for a human to play to me, and especially with opposite colored bishops, which have a good reputation for being good for the attacking side, and also, well, during, like, assuming we're attacking the king, but also very good at blocking past pawns. I can totally understand why Anand wanted no piece of this. I mean, it's very easy logically to justify saying, look, the white bishop on e6 will stop any business that we have from these past pawns, and the black king side will remain compromised, giving serious attacking chances. It's a very hard move for a human to play, so I don't think we can fault Anand too much for this. Instead, he elected to play bishop d4, which is a nice active move. And he's not afraid of this pawn structure whatsoever, because he can put his pawn on e5, which will stop any problems, and more importantly, this open f file with the pin on the f2 pawn could be annoying. Pretty quickly we saw this pawn structure anyway, although Carlsen did play rook e2 here. So now a strong move from Anand to c4, looking to capture on d3. So if white takes on c4 after b takes c4, this pawn on b2 is a very serious problem. And it's not going to be easy at all for white to solve it, because, okay, let's say we exchange. A move like rook b1 will fail to c3, which just, I think, immediately ends the game, because we're going to get such a passed pawn. Rook a2 also would have some problems after c3, because this rook b1 check will lead to serious issues. So Carlsen made a prudent decision here, and he played bishop e4, which is a strong move. Okay, so at the moment, black is up a pawn, and he'll probably stay up a pawn, although not the same one. But he's got so many weak pawns, all of which are on white squares, and his king is compromised, so I don't think that Carlsen should have any real difficulty holding this position together. So, queen b4 from Anand, and now here Carlsen immediately played rook a d1, which is a very strong, cool, and collected move. If he were to just try to take this pawn off right away, black has a whole multitude of good options on what to do here. Probably the simplest is queen takes b2, remaining with an extra pawn and forcing white to become passive, defending this guy, because we're attacking the rook and f2, so after something like rook f1, maybe just b4. And this pawn might just get to b2 in the next 3 moves, which would be a serious crisis for white. Another option for black after rook takes d3 is probably bishop takes f2 check, in the event of king takes f2, rook takes d3, and queen d2 check. Seems like black should be winning his piece back with a continuing attack and a very promising position. So Carlsen correctly understood he wanted no piece of this. I'm sure this was a very trivial decision for him to play rook a d1. And at this point, black is still up a pawn, and he can take on b2, which he did in the game. I'm not entirely convinced it's the best move. I think the computer was recommending rook to f8 here, just looking to play something like this, and now queen d6, trying to attack the weakened white king side and use active pieces to his advantage, but realistically I doubt that there's any serious winning chances for black here. So Anand captured on b2. Now Carlsen played a very cool and collected move again, queen f3. It's very nice that he's able to defend this well. So he's ready to take back on d3 next move, and he probably didn't want to yet, because after rook takes d3, rook takes d3, he'd be required to take with the bishop, because rook takes d3 would fail on account of queen e1 check, where king g2, defending the pawn, would break the connection between the queen and the bishop on e4. After queen takes e4 check, black's in great shape, or completely winning, excuse me. And after this, okay, with 2 extra pawns now, and the white king side being weakened, I think black has very, very good winning chances, probably much higher than white's drawing chances. So that would be problematic. Of course, white could recapture with the bishop on d3, but I'm not such a fan. So queen f3 is a very nice move from Carlsen, and probably he solved all of his problems. Bishop f6 from Anand. Do some exchanging. And here was Anand's last chance to try to make something of the position. As you can see, he's got 6 minutes left for the next 4 moves, which is not a ton. But the computer was still advocating bishop d4 and claiming that black had some advantage. Personally, I think that white should hold this without much trouble. The black kingside pawn and kingside just so weak, and his king is so open, and with the opposite color bishops and all black's pawns on white squares, I think that there shouldn't be any serious winning chances. But you never know. I mean, the computer did advocate this move and claim that black was better. Instead, after the game continuation of rook d8, the game's immediately drawn. So Anand, well, okay, first of all, let's cover the rest of it. At this point, Anand is still up a pawn, but he's just going to lose one back. In fact, he gave it immediately. Somewhere around here, I think actually Carlsen declined a draw offer, which was probably a very strong psychological ploy. He's the best player in the world right now, at least by the rating list. I mean, I guess he's challenging for the World Championship. But, I mean, he hasn't been that convincing here, and okay, being the best player in the world, he obviously knows that there's absolutely no way on planet Earth he's ever going to win this position. It's just going to be a draw. But white has the moral advantage because his pawn structure is more intact. And it's sort of just sending a message to Anand saying, like, look, I don't care how equal the position is, I'm going to play. And sure enough, Anand had no issues whatsoever defending this position. The game was drawn very shortly. But I do like the fact that Carlsen declined a draw offer. I think it might rattle Vichy a little bit. So, some people would say it's disrespectful. I'd say it's strategic. As chess players, during the game, as long as we're operating within the rules, I think we should do everything we can to win. And, okay, Carlsen clearly judged that, for whatever reason, declining the draw offer was the appropriate course of action. And Anand played g5, which I like. I mean, white certainly is not going to win if black just sits tight, but if you can force the draw, why not? So after exchanging and h4, okay, white can end up with an extra pawn, but I probably could trade my golden retriever to draw this position. He's only rated 1100. So very quickly, queen c7 now. Okay, the game is promptly done. So just to be good sports, they played all the way out to king without any pawns left. So we see another draw in game 3, but definitely one with a lot more life than what we saw in games 1 and 2. And it begs the question, what's going to happen in the rest of the match? Tomorrow we're going to see Anand play his first real white game. I mean, I'm saying this because I think both sides decided to give their first white game just as sort of a feeler to try to see what their opponent was doing, much like Promnik did against Anand as well, playing the exchange Slav. So both the battle lines have been drawn. It's clear that Anand is trying to do something with the pawn on d5, so the fact that he's playing d5 on move 1 against knight f3 suggests to me, even though he played sort of a Grunfeld-esque way, he's not planning on playing the Grunfeld against d4, he's planning on playing d5, either Slav or Queen's Gambit declined. And Carlsen showed Caro-Kann for the game 1 with black, and I mean, it's not something he's played super often, but he certainly held very easily, although I don't think Anand was really trying to do anything too special. He was just trying to sort of take the temperature of the situation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow. I personally predict that Anand will play e4 again and see if Magnus wants to repeat the Caro-Kann. And if he does, Anand will come with a little bit more fire to his play. It's also possible Anand will play d4, another sort of feeler game, trying to feel what Carlsen has in mind against d4. So on the whole, I mean, it's clear the first couple of games were not so interesting, but the match is starting to heat up, and, well, I'm expecting some fireworks in the next few days. So I'm not sure if I will be doing any more Game of the Day coverage, but if not, thank you very much for your attention, and this was Grandmaster Sam Shankland. Have a good day.